Unit 3 Supplement, Making Assumptions and Using Brackets, an in-depth how-to. What are assumptions? They are lines you introduce into your proof to show that the assumption entails some other thing, to prove a third thing. There's two kinds: indirect proof, in which you assume something, demonstrate that it entails a contradiction, and prove the negation of what you assumed. And conditional proof, in which you assume something, demonstrate literally anything else, and prove a conditional from the thing you assumed to anything it entails. What are assumptions not? They are not deductions, inferences, or intermediate conclusions like regular lines of a proof are. Regular lines are ones that you've proved are entailed by the premises. Assumptions need not be entailed by the premises. They are not necessarily true or false, given that the premises are true. Importantly, neither are any lines derived from assumptions. Any line that cites the assumption, or cites a line that cites the assumption, or cites a line that cites a line that cites the assumption, is also not a deduction, inference, or intermediate conclusion. These lines depend on both premises and the assumption. They're not necessarily true or false, given that the premises are true. Given all that, why can we use assumptions? Well, for one thing, we use them all the time in real-life reasoning, which natural deduction hopes to model. They're like hypotheticals. Asking what would it be like if something were the case often tells us something about what is the case. So what can we use assumptions for? There's only two things in our system: indirect proof, in which we assume X, show Y and not Y, a contradiction, and derive the opposite of what we assumed, not X. And conditional proof, in which we assume, show anything that that assumption entails, and derive the conditional between them. We assume X, show Y, and derive if X then Y. There are no other ways to use assumptions in our system. Do not use an assumption if you are not going to do indirect proof or conditional proof. There would be no reason to, and there would be nothing that you would be able to use that assumption for later on. You can use indirect or conditional proof to prove your conclusion, or you can prove any intermediate conclusion that you think will help you solve the proof. Practically, how do we use assumptions? Brackets. There's a few ways to do brackets. The first is to use the vertical line key, shift backslash. That's what I usually use, and we'll see it in the rest of the examples here. Here, lines 3 and 4, highlighted, show the use of the vertical line backslash. But if you prefer, you could indent, you could do both, or you could draw the line by hand. When we make our assumptions, we say we open the bracket on the assumption line. In line 3, we've assumed, and there's the line for the bracket. Continue to bracket each line until you complete the indirect or the conditional proof. This little proof only does for 2 lines, but your proofs might go quite a bit longer than that. Then, you close the bracket. The line in which you cite indirect proof or conditional proof goes outside the brackets. Your bracket ends on the line right before that. The line where you cite indirect or conditional proof is outside the brackets because now we've proved it to be entailed by the premises. It doesn't depend on the assumption. Line 5, even though it uses the assumption for the indirect proof, it doesn't depend on it at all. It turns out our premise 1, is all we really needed to entail line 5. Okay, but do we really need to use the brackets? Yes. Lines 2 and 5 are now proved to be entailed by the premises. They don't depend on the assumption. But lines 3 and 4 are not entailed by the premises. And in this case, they're both false. The only purpose of lines 3 and 4 is to prove line 5. The brackets help us keep straight which lines of the proof are real and which lines are just there for the sake of argument. Take a look at this proof with no brackets. It's hard to read. It's hard to tell if you've made a typo, just forgotten to do the bracket, or if you actually don't understand the concept of how assumptions work, how indirect proof works. There are some rules for citing with brackets in your proof. You're allowed to cite from inside to outside, and to cite from inside to inside the same bracket. You're not allowed to cite from outside brackets to inside, or from inside brackets to inside different brackets. Inside to outside is allowed because outside, unbracketed lines are entailed by the premises. They're fair game regardless of any assumptions you make. They can be cited anywhere in the proof. Inside to inside works because everything inside the same bracket depends on the same things, the premises and the same assumption. Outside brackets to inside brackets does not work because when you're working outside of brackets, you are writing lines entailed by the premises alone. Lines inside brackets depend on assumptions that might be false, so those lines might be false too. You can't prove a conclusion true, your goal, if you're mixing in false lines with true ones. And you can't cite from inside brackets to inside a different set of brackets. Yes, you can have more than one set of brackets in a proof. We'd better see an example. So here's a somewhat nasty looking proof at first that will actually turn out to be relatively simple. Let's take a look at the conclusion and see why we might want to use two different sets of brackets in one proof. The conclusion here is a conjunction of a negated sentence letter, which is always a good time to use IP, and a conditional, always a good time to use CP. Let's take a look at how we might use two completely different sets of brackets in one short proof. First thing we'll do is make our assumption. Now, when you make an assumption, it's always good to make a note off to the side saying your goal, here it's an indirect proof, we're looking for a contradiction, and what you hope to prove. In this case, not P. This can really help you keep straight when you are doing indirect and conditional proofs. Notice that we opened the bracket on the assumption line. We're going to continue bracketing all the lines until we find a contradiction. So in our next line, we applied De Morgan's to line 1. Note that this step could have been done outside the bracket, but now that it's in, we cannot cite line 4 from outside the bracket after we find our contradiction. Then we'll do a modus ponens. This line more directly relies on the assumption, since it, cites it. Then we'll simplify out not R, and we'll simplify out not Q and not Q, and there's our contradiction. We can close the bracket. We have proved not P. It doesn't matter that P and not P isn't our contradiction. Any old contradiction will do. So, our bracket's closed, our indirect proof is complete, and we have proved the negation of our initial assumption. Notice that line 8 has no brackets. Indirect proof shows that the premises entail not P. This is just a regular outside line, and it can be cited anywhere. Now we'll start making our next assumption. We'll start with Q, since that's the antecedent of the conditional we're looking for. Our new assumption gets a new bracket. It's totally independent of the first bracket. Just as before, it's good to write down your goal, what you want to prove, and how you'll close the bracket. We want to do a conditional proof. We want to prove if Q, then not R, so we'll close the bracket whenever we come to not R. Done! Look, there's not R in line 6. Conditional proof, 9, 6. I hope this raised a red flag for you, because, no, we can't cite from one bracket to another. They depend on different assumptions. That's just not how conditional proof works. Okay, fine. Now we're done. Simplification, line 5, not R. Conditional proof, if Q then not R, 9 through 10. Well, that's closer, but still no. We've still cited from inside one bracket to a previous bracket that's already closed. We just can't go back to line 5. All line 5 has done is help us prove line 8. Okay, how about now? Back to the premise, simplification, not R. Yeah, that will work. we've cited from inside a bracket to outside a bracket. In this case, we've cited the premise, and that's perfectly fine. Now we can do our conditional proof, and it's still just a 2-line conditional, 9 through 10. As a side note, conditional proof isn't strictly necessary here. We could have done this with a longer and more complicated set of rules involving simplification, addition, material implication. Well, sometimes conditional proof really just is easier and shorter, and that's one of its virtues. In any case, this proof is done. We can join lines 8 and 11. By the way, that's the only 2 previous lines that we had written that are outside of brackets, but they can both be cited from anywhere. Each set of bracketed lines has demonstrated exactly 1 line of our proof. 3 through 7 gave us line 8, 9 and 10 gave us line 11. Putting them together is all it takes for us to reach our conclusion in line 12. Notice how difficult it would be to read, and therefore how difficult to grade, this proof without any brackets. The brackets, like the parentheses, are the grammar of logic. Just as if you wrote me a paper with really bad grammar, I would have to score you less because I wouldn't know if you were making the kinds of mistakes that are more forgivable, like typos, or the kinds of mistakes that say you deserve to be graded down because you don't understand the concept. If you don't put your brackets in, then you haven't proved to me that you understand the concept of how to use indirect and conditional proof. This otherwise perfect proof would not be able to score higher than 4 out of 5. So, please do keep this in mind when you go to take your quizzes and/or exams.